Now, in spite of the fact that the claim that the unexamined life is not worth living is one of the most famous remarks in Western philosophy, if you think about it, even if it's familiar, familiarity does often bring contentment. Even though it's familiar, it's actually quite controversial. That is to say, on its most direct and simple-minded interpretation, the unexamined life is not worth living seems to imply that if you don't engage in self-examination, your life is not worth living, in the sense it seems that it would have been better had you not been born in the first place. So think about a stark example of a life that's not worth living. Suppose that there's been a little baby born, and she's born with a terrible congenital disease that doctors do not know how to cure. She seems to be in constant pain. In the course of her life, she's never able to show or experience any emotions that we know of. She never seems to smile back at people when they smile at her. She seems to cry most of the time. She just seems very uncomfortable. And then after 6 months, she passes away. Now, here's an example in which we might very well say, following the bioethicists who use the term zero line, that this baby has never gotten above the zero line being a line below which, if you never get above that line, your life is not worth living. It would have been better if the baby had never been born. All she did was suffer. You can understand, I think, how somebody might take that view. That's not uncontroversial, but you can understand why somebody might think that's a reasonable view about a person whose life has gone like that. Whereas most of us, with most of our lives, even if we do experience pain and discomfort, depression, upset, and disappointment, most of us would say, in spite of that, we're well above the zero line. Likewise, even if you don't engage in self-examination, it's hard to see how that would make you go below the zero line. So consider an example such as Maria, who's a campaigner working to protect women in the little Eastern European country of Moldova, one of the poorest countries in Europe. And Maria wants to protect women in Moldova because it's not, as is now well known, there's a problem of prostitution and sexual slavery that starts out in places like Moldova. Young women get lured by essentially pimps to come to their small towns in the countryside and say, hey, I've got a wonderful job for you in Paris or in London or Berlin, Budapest, in which you'll be working at a boutique and so forth. Just come with me. I'll carry your passport with me and take good care of it to make sure it's safe, and I'll set you up in a nice cushy job in one of these boutiques in a big city. All too often what happens is that they give up their passport all right, and then the pimp in question forces them into a form of sexual slavery, and they are often never seen again. So Maria's goal in life is to try to let young women who might be preyed upon by these pimps to watch out for them and not believe what they say, in spite of their nice suits and flashy cars, that they're just going to, in fact, what they're going to do is just exploit these women. So suppose Maria is a dedicated campaigner. She spends all of her waking time doing what she can to keep young women in Moldova from being lured by men into this kind of trap. And you feel like perhaps she's so tired at the end of the day that she doesn't have time to engage in any self-examination. And yet it seems awfully strange to say, even though Maria does not live an examined life in the way that Socrates might envision, that therefore her life is not worth living. That seems very high-handed, perhaps too intellectual. And just as the case with Maria, so too you can think of many, many lives that are worthwhile because someone contributes to somebody else's well-being, does something that helps out the world in some way, even though that comes naturally to them. It's not something that they plan or think about or philosophize about. It's just something that they do instinctively almost. And nevertheless, it seems like their life is worth living, even though they don't engage in self-examination. So the most simple-minded and strict interpretation of the claim that the unexamined life is not worth living seems implausible to many. Seems like it just is too demanding and rules out as valueless and below the zero line the lives of many, many people, perhaps even the majority of people who are alive right now, who just don't have the time or the energy or the resources to engage in examination or self-examination of the sorts of Socrates counsels. Now here's another interpretation that is offered by Professor Richard Kraut of Northwestern University, who's a specialist in the work of Plato and Aristotle, as well as Socrates, their teacher. Professor Kraut suggests that we should reread the phrase, the unexamined life is not worth living. If we look at the original Greek, we find the word biotos, which translates as to be lived. And on that interpretation, we understand the unexamined life is not worth living as really meaning the unexamined life is not to be lived. You're missing out on something of value if you fail to engage in self-examination, which does not mean that your life is without value, but rather there's a hole there. There's something missing that anybody who lives a full life should be wanting to fill. So I was once listening to the radio and the DJ came on and after a song finished and said, "If you don't dig that music, you've got a hole in your soul." And I was struck by that remark because it suggested that, yeah, if you fail to appreciate music of that kind, that might have been a certain kind of jazz, I don't remember exactly what music was on at the time. If you don't appreciate that kind of music, then you're missing something that any full, satisfying life would have in it. And so likewise, if you don't engage in self-examination, your life can still be worthwhile, but still missing, but still without something important, just as you can live a worthwhile life and a valuable life in which you don't engage in or appreciate or experience any love. A life without love is still a life that might be worth living, and yet is missing something significant and of great value. Now, Kraut goes on and points out that many of the characters in some of the most famous dialogues, other Socratic dialogues and Platonic dialogues that we won't be discussing in this class, still exemplify ways in which people might fail to engage in valuable self-examination. So for instance, in fact, one of the dialogues that's in our book for this semester, the Euthyphro, is an example in which Socrates confronts his friend Euthyphro. Euthyphro is about to go into one of the law courts, and Socrates says to his friend Euthyphro, "Hey, what's up? What are you doing here at one of the law courts? I know I'm on trial, but what brings you here?" Euthyphro says, "Well, I'm prosecuting my father." And Socrates says, "Really? We were prosecuting your father. Why are you doing that?" And Euthyphro replies, "Well, because he killed one of our employees, and I think he needs to be prosecuted for that." And Socrates, knowing full well that it's awfully unusual for one family member to take another family member to court, even when there's been a murder that has occurred, is quite surprised by this answer. And then he continues to ask Euthyphro, "Well, you must know what justice and virtue and right action are." And Euthyphro says, You're right, I do. I do know what these things are and what their basis is. But Socrates, after a couple more pages, shows Euthyphro that he's not really clear on what those things are. He shows Euthyphro as really more dogmatic than anything else, and thereby shows Euthyphro has not been engaging in appropriate self-examination. As a result, Euthyphro is in danger of doing something that's highly improper and ill-advised. It may be the case that he's mistaken in prosecuting his father for something that has happened. We're not given an answer to that question, but Socrates makes clear that Euthyphro has, at best, a very partial and incomplete grasp on the nature of right and wrong. And this is a result of being dogmatic rather than asking himself what is right and what is wrong. Likewise, later on in the series of events that is roughly represented by the 5 Dialogues book that we have for this semester, Socrates has now been put in prison. He's been accused and charged and convicted of the crime of corrupting the youth and various other things. He's now in prison, has been sentenced to death. He's waiting for the day on which he's going to have to get his death sentence or actually be put to death. And his friend Crito comes along very early one morning and says, "Socrates, it's early. Let's hurry. Gather together your things. I'm going to help you escape. I'm able to bribe the appropriate guards. We can get out of here under disguise, and we just need to go, and no one will make such a big deal out of it. And besides, if I don't help you escape, then given that everybody knows that I've got enough money to pay off the jailers, bribe them, and help you escape, if you don't let me help you escape, I'll be embarrassed because people will say I was too cheap to help you to get out of jail." Socrates responds, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to escape just because you're worried about being embarrassed. If I want to get out of jail, I will explain to the world why I'm justified in doing so. But on the other hand, if I think that it's right for me to be put to death under these conditions, I'll just stay right here. I'm not going to pay attention to the question whether or not you're in danger of being embarrassed." So Crito, again, is an example of someone who is, according to Socrates, living an insufficiently examined life because he's motivated more by the fear of being embarrassed than he is by doing what he thinks is right. Third example, Ion, in a dialogue known as Ion, I-O-N, is an example of what's known as a rhapsode. He is known for going around ancient Greece and reciting Homer, reciting the Odyssey, and telling people great stories from Homer's Odyssey. Now, Ion just is an empty vessel, so to speak. He just repeats the lines from the poem. There's no reason to think he has any understanding of what happens in the story. And as a result, he is another example of a person who fails to engage in self-examination. He just mouths the lines without trying to figure out what they mean, what their significance is, whether they're plausible or not. And the final example is Glaucon, G-L-A-U-C-O-N, from Plato's Republic. Glaucon asks Socrates, when they're trying to figure out what the best kind of life to live is, Glaucon says, look, if I had a ring that could make me invisible, what's referred to in the story, what's now referred back to as the ring of Gyges. If I had such a ring that could make me invisible, of course I'd use it. Of course I'd use it to gain an advantage over other people, steal things with no repercussions, get into places that I wouldn't otherwise be able to get into. And likewise, if you had an analog of the ring of Gyges, suppose you had, for example, unlimited hacker ability so that you could hack into any website that you wanted to, including those websites that hold your transcripts, for example, your GRE scores, your LSAT scores, what have you. If you might be very tempted by that prospect. Socrates says, if you are tempted by the prospect of getting power and wealth and glory and so forth in this cheating way, then you are also engaging in an insufficient amount of self-examination precisely because you are not thinking about the repercussions of gaining things in that way. If you were to end up at the top of the world by those illegitimate means, I think Socrates would suggest, you will find that be an empty victory. And as a result, you haven't examined your own life and the things that value as much as you should. So Socrates' point here is the following. Each of these characters, Euthyphro, Crito, Ion, and Glaucon, are examples of people who engage in an insufficient amount of self-examination. They are living lives that are still worthwhile, but they are living lives that are not to be lived. They're missing something of value precisely because they are not they're not reflecting on many of the presuppositions with which they're acting. So too, you might think about whether or not you know an example of someone, an actual person in your life or a fictional character you've come across in some of your reading or movies you've watched, poems you've read, plays you've seen, who could, any such person who could do with more self-examination, so, more of an ability to think about the things that motivate them to do the things that they do, to pursue the things that they're pursuing, and ask whether those are actually worthwhile, valuable aims to have. Can you think of anybody who could do with more self-examination?